morning, Shira.
Good morning, Esty.
So last week we talked about how important play is for adults.
Right.
So we figured that this week we should talk about why playing with children is so hard.
Yes.
And before we jump into the topic, which I'm so excited to talk about because whenever we talk about something that I am also struggling with, I get to learn and grow from it. I want to jump back to winter blues for a minute. And it connects to this topic. When we talked about winter blues, I was at a point where the past few winters had been hard. Then we did the research for winter blues, we talked it out, we podcasted it, and I really took some tips from it and I really implemented it into this winter. And I have to say, I've been seeing a little bit of a better winter.
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
How podcast works.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like this play with children, I'm wondering if it's going to be the same situation because I think we're going to talk about like real life struggles that many parents have, myself included. And I've been already doing research and I already have like so many tips that I plan to implement. And I hope that I too am going to see some changes from it.
Mm-hmm. That sounds amazing. And I think, from all of our podcasts, like, sometimes we go in saying, we know this already, or, we're experts in this, and this is day-to-day work for us. Other times we go in and we figure out new things and we find new things and then we apply it. And then afterwards, it does change our lives. It's like for myself, like, let's say this winter, like when I was listening to Winter Blues and when we were preparing for the Winter Blues, like I was excited to try it out. And then afterwards, like my winter also, I must say, like it's going pretty well. And now we're almost up to Purim and I'm excited like that the winter's almost over and I survived it, not just survived it, I really did appreciate it.
Yeah.
And so each of our podcasts, like it's exciting to see like which nugget do we get from it? Like what application really helps us?
Yeah. And both of us, like in our, like you're saying, like sometimes we go in as an expert because that's what we work with or that's a specialty. Like both of us don't specifically work with children.
Mm-hmm.
We're both
Right.
always around children. Children exist in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but in our private practices, we're both not sitting and doing play therapy with
Right.
children. So,
Mm-hmm. I actually thought that at a certain point I would be working with
Yeah.
children. One of my friends in college was going for graphic design and she made me a whole portfolio, child-based.
Oh, interesting.
Because I really thought that I was going to be working with teens and children and playing with games all day. And then I just totally turned away from it and I landed in adult work. But
Interesting.
who knows, maybe I'll go back to child work one day.
Right. I don't know. It never specifically interested me.
No. Yeah.
I'll have to delve into that another time.
that new information, right?
Exactly.
What's going on there? So I'm really excited also like to see like what comes out and to also share with everybody like what it is that we've learned and what it is that maybe can help them with playing with their children.
Yeah. So let's jump right into it of something that, I myself feel, and I feel like I've heard from so many people is why is playing with children so hard?
Yes.
And that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
That's just like big.
And I think like the time factor is such a big thing, and how everybody is just like pushed to the limit. Like going back, I mean, we're gonna reference a lot of our old podcasts today, but when we think about like push yourself, like when we're pushing yourself to do another thing, and then play just becomes another thing on the checklist, and it's like okay, do the laundry, cook supper, feed everybody, and then you have to also play with the kids,
Right.
and it becomes a task rather than inherently enjoyable, and that's not what play is. Like the whole point of play is that it has to be really enjoyable and something where you're not thinking about the time and you're not just trying to like get to an agenda. It has to just be presence. And that's what makes it, I think, at least very hard for a majority of people.
Yeah, I think that, when you say this, like when you're saying about the time for play, like I'm resonating of like coming home from work, like the kids are nagging me, they need food, I need to make supper, I need to clean up the house. And then I also kind of feel like I should be playing with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then also all those voices like start in my head of like, why aren't you playing with them?
Yeah.
And if I am playing with them, why aren't you being more present? Why are you looking at your phone? Why are you half cooking while you're playing with them? And all those like mom guilt and mom shaming and like bad thoughts get in my head. And I love what Dr. Becky said is that you don't have to like everything that you do. And I thought that was like such a freeing thought of like you take out the garbage and nobody likes taking out the garbage. But when they go take out the garbage, they don't think about like, why don't I like this? And I'm such a bad person for not liking taking out the garbage. But yet with playing, that happens. I'm like, oh, I'm such a bad person because I'm not enjoying this right now.
Right.
Such a bad person because I don't want to do this. And we know this. We as therapists, we know that those voices just take us down.
They're not helpful.
They're not helpful. And there's nothing wrong. And there's nothing bad about you when you don't like to play. It's just a fact.
Right.
Now, is there tips and there's tricks to, learn how to stretch your boundary and learn how to step out of your comfort zone so you could like play? Yes. And we can get to that. But first, and I'm talking to myself when I'm saying this right now because when I heard Dr. Becky say this, I'm like, duh, as a therapist, That's the answer to everything that we tell people. And that goes back to our push yourself episode all the time, right?
Yeah.
That critical voice in your head is not going to help you.
No.
And that's really what keeps you
Trapped.
trapped. Yeah, as a mom, it's so hard for me to take this lesson that I know and I use in other areas of my life to practically put it with parenting and playing with my child. I don't know why it's so hard to do that. Maybe the mom guilt and the mom shame is just so strong, but it's okay. And when you accept that, that's the first step of breaking free from that trap.
I think that's like the first step that prevents people, because what they're feeling is like, if I do this, I have to like it. If I don't like it, it's not going to work. And it's not true. It's similar to like other things in our lives that we just do. Also, like once you start doing it, then you start to like it. But if you never do it, you'll never know if you like it.
Right. And if you do it with the voices in your head of
Mhm.
I'm so bad and all that, and then the shame, and then you go down a shame
Right.
spiral, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm so bad. Why don't I like this? I'm such a bad parent.
Mhm.
Maybe this, maybe that, maybe I'm a bad wife, maybe I'm a bad this.
Right.
And it never ends.
Exactly.
Just do it. Accept that you don't like it. And then you'll see
Yeah.
the change that happens. I mean, this is everything
Mhm.
with like all work is just like accept that you don't like it, accept that you're not good. And then so much change happens.
Yeah. The nice thing about kids is that they don't pick up what you're thinking. Especially when they're younger, they have no clue. They think that every single parent is just waiting at the bus stop. Like from the time they drop them off until the time they pick them up, they think they're just standing there. And so ultimately, like a child doesn't really know if you are enjoying or if you're not enjoying, like completely. Like, yes, they might. If you're in a bad mood, they're going to pick that up. But like if you're like faking it until you make it, like they're not going to realize that. Like
Right.
they just want you to be there. They want you to be present. And you might just be stuck in your head and what you think might be the wrong way of parenting. They just want you to be sitting there and playing with them. Like they don't care what's going on in your mind. Like they just want you to sit with the game with them. They just want you to focus on them. And so sometimes we have to like shut down that chatter that's going on in our minds and just say like it's good enough.
Yeah. So why is play so hard? You talked about the aspect of time.
Mm-hmm.
I think the aspect of being present is
Yes.
also really hard for people.
Yeah.
To sit there and really be present in the game or in the play or whatever's happening. It's just so hard because wait, one, we're busy. We have so much going on in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this I heard from Dvorak, who's a clinical social worker and specifically works a lot with children. She said the phone, and we all know about how bad the phone is and blah, blah, blah. But she said all of our attention span, all adults have just gotten smaller because we're so used to the ding of the phone. Is that another email? Somebody calling me, somebody texting me, or just used to that like instant gratification on the phone that like sitting and actually being present with your child has become so much harder for our generation.
I think another thing that's really hard about play is that in order to play, you then have to reflect back to your own childhood. Like that's what they say. Like the hardest thing about childhood, and the hardest thing about connecting with your child is thinking back to your own childhood of who played with you, what type of play occurred, like how much freedom, how much independent play did you have, like how was your parenting style, the parenting style that you received. And I think that's really hard for parents because like as they're sitting with their child, like they don't realize that they're triggered from their own childhood. And you have to like, I think like if people go and they're not necessarily like connecting with their kids, they then don't necessarily have to connect back to their own experiences. And
Yeah.
here, when you're sitting with your child, and it's not always so exciting, right? Sometimes it might be boring, it might be slower paced. You're sitting there and you're thinking, it might remind you of some of the things you went through that weren't so pleasant, or some of the things that you went through that you rather not think about. And so ultimately, I think people are disconnecting from their children as a defense against just reconnecting with their earlier years.
Yeah, because there's a lot of, things that happen that you wished may have happened differently or triggers that are coming up. And it's hard to face that on a daily basis. It's not like
Yeah.
once in a while. It's like a daily basis.
Yeah.
You want to be present and connect with your child. You have to be present and connect to your own inner child.
Exactly. And, meeting that inner child. And also, there might be some regression. Like, you might then feel things about things. And I think that's really hard for people because kids definitely bring that out. When you look at young adults, right? Like, they're like 15, 16, 17, 18. Like, from teenage to young adults, they're always saying, like, I'm not going to be that type of parent.
Right.
Or I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to let my kid, watch a movie. I'm never going to let my kid sit by the phone. I'm never going to let my kid, and I'm never going to do this as a mom. And I'm never going to say that. And then slowly, like, what happens as you start entering momhood, you then become your parents in some way. And
Yes.
that's super, super scary. If you said you're never going to be something and then you become
Yes.
it, and I think that makes a lot of people have panic attacks of like, oh my God, I just said that. How can I say that? I
Right.
hated when my parents said that.
Like if you
And
continue, if you, what's that line that my parents always said? But I feel like is a universal thing. You continue to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. I'm gonna cut that out, Tati. Sorry, saving that blooper, but we'll cut that out.
yeah, like all these things, or even like actions, right? That people do, like, for me, like my mom always wore like a snood, and I said I'm never gonna wear a snood. Like I'm only gonna wear a wig. And like the first time I wore the snood, my husband's like, oh, never say never. Like you are gonna do
Exactly.
this, and I'm like, right, of course, it's more comfortable. Or like it's just like it's just too annoying when you're cooking. You don't want like your hair getting in the food. Like it's gross. So there's just like all those things that were like, I'm not gonna do that because it comes from a place of like, when my parents did this, it hurt me in some way, or I didn't like it in some way, and I'm going to be different from that. And then as you find yourself moving towards it, you're like, oh no, like, am I going to now mess up my kid? Am I going to mess up myself also? And so like tons and tons of triggers coming up. And I think that if like we avoid the play, or if we avoid the focusing and we avoid the connection, we don't have to connect that part of ourselves.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm hearing us talk a lot about is that play is connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is connection. Like a child doesn't know necessarily how to connect with words. Like when you watch parents, sometimes like the way that their entry into play is they'll go over to the kid and they'll say, what are you doing? What are you playing? What's that over there? And the child's like, go away, don't bother me. Like there's no explanations for the play. Like their way of connecting is saying like, like let me put the truck around, and they're moving the truck, and then you go over, along with them, and you're like, oh, let's move the truck together. And you just copy them, or you just like, you enter into their fantasy rather than saying like, wait, like let's bring it into reality over there. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like how come you're putting out the fire with candy? Like how come you're beating up the dolphin with the penguin? Like it
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense necessarily, but for them it's like this fantasy world. And I was really like when I work with clients who are, let's say, depressed, and this was like a eureka moment with me, like for me when I had it, a lot of times what they'll say is that when they're having all of these like extreme self-hatred thoughts, which come from childhood trauma, obviously, of being told you're not good enough, you're not good enough, a lot of times like what they'll do is they'll say the only thing to shut down those thoughts is to think of death,
Mm.
because telling themselves it's going to get better, life showed them that it might not get better, so they can't hold on to that. They need something definite at that moment to shut down. So what do? They go into their fantasy world and they say death is coming. I'm not going to have to deal with this anymore, later today or tomorrow. And they start thinking about something, and they start fantasizing about how they're going to kill themselves. And I don't mean for this to be morbid. I think it's just
It's went from
important.
child and play to depression and death.
But I think they're so connected, right? Because if you're not playing in childhood in the proper fantasy world, or teaching children how to escape into that fantasy world, they're
Wow.
not going to be able to do it at a later age. And so what happens
Wait,
is,
but I think we just have to pause because that's just like a huge statement that you just said.
Mhm,
And I think that needs like a minute to like
to sit with it and
to
process.
sit with that and process that because like, we were talking about like children kind of like all lightly and now you're bringing in something that's really real,
Mhm,
but also really scary.
yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that if we're not going to take the time to develop play and have a way to escape into fantasy, then for people that are struggling with depression, people that are struggling with a bad day, it might lead them to escape to death instead, the thoughts of
Mhm.
death instead.
They don't know how to go to a good place in their minds. They've never learned how to be in a fantasy world in a way that's playful, in a way that's positive, because when they're going to that fantasy, what happens is that it just becomes too reality based. They can't let go of themselves enough to just play.
Wow.
And that's really hard. So instead, they have to give themselves a practical fantasy, which is, I need to die. And that's the only thing that calms down their thoughts. They have no other way of escapism. A lot of times, distraction and escape has a very negative connotation, but I think there is something so healthy about it. Like on the flip side, how we can say those things is guided imagery, mindfulness, directed thoughts, right? And so we're trying to get people away from those negative thoughts into like some other world, right? To help them like escape their body for a moment in a healthy way. But if we're not teaching people how to go into that fantasy world, we're not giving them a critical tool for life. And that critical tool is the ability to escape when things are dangerous and when things feel really overwhelmed. We need to be able to shut off our minds and go into a better place. And obviously, somebody who's doing that in a long term fashion, it's really, really bad. But somebody who can't do that in small ways has to then find reality based ways of disconnecting. And
Right.
sometimes that means a concrete answer of thinking about death or thinking about suicide, which is not pleasant. And then it leads into its own spiral, because then, obviously when someone's going to that, it leads us into the legal piece of, oh, well, if you're thinking that way, I'm gonna have to put you in a hospital. And I never want to do that. But so it's almost like thinking about like the playfulness aspect of when people are becoming suicidal, and recognizing like how me coming in and being, let's me coming in and saying something like, well, let's go to the hospital. Let's think about like if you need to be in a safe space, like I'm meeting them in the reality. I'm not understanding their need for escapism.
Right.
I'm not giving them that escape, because ultimately what they're saying is that I don't need to escape life. I need to escape my thoughts.
Right.
But I've never learned how to escape my thoughts. So therefore, I just need to use this. And it's almost like teaching them how to do a guided imagery instead, teaching them how to calm their minds down, which is a lot harder when you're older rather than when you're 4 years old.
Right. I wonder if there's a component of that why it makes play so hard for parents, because if somebody themselves were never really taught how to play,
Yeah.
or for some reason it's so painful to go
Mhm.
down that way, it just makes them very hard to connect with their child and go down into that fantasy world with them. Because we
Yeah.
hear a lot of parents that say, listen, I can do a board game, I can do magnet tiles, I can do Legos, but like the imagination play,
Oh,
that I can't do.
right.
And a lot of it is not knowing as an adult also how to go into
Yeah.
that fantasy world, into the world of
Right.
imagination. And I think that also, like, we play so many parts in our lives, and we talked about this a little bit in the authenticity podcast about being authentic to yourself, and we have certain parts that, let's say, overtake our authenticity.
Mhm.
So I think that can happen in life as well. You're a working mom, you know what I mean? So you are a principal all day. It's really hard to then disconnect from that principal part of yourself and now go into an imaginary world, or
Mhm.
or just a mom, or you're a mom and you have to cook and you have to clean, you have to take care of your kids, and you have to do.
Yeah.
So to stop and pause and connect to different parts of yourself that you may not have the ability to be can also be very painful,
Yeah.
which is what we said by authenticity, which is why sometimes we block ourselves from being our whole authentic self. And I think that's very connected to play, because it's too hard to play the part of the astronaut,
Mhm.
because I wish I can escape and go travel the world.
Right.
So to play that in imaginary game, it's bringing up a part of me that I can't develop right now, so it
Right.
hurts.
Imagination is the hardest thing for me. As a kid, I never wanted to play with dolls or doll houses. Instead, like I wanted to run, or I wanted to like, tap tap trio, or like hide and go seek, like anything outdoors. But, like when it came, I remember like my parents gave me this huge dollhouse for Hanukkah one year, and I like looked at it and I never touched it. And then afterwards, like my brother had these like two friends that came over, and the next day I saw them playing with with this dollhouse, and like I never visited it. Like my mother put it in storage because I wasn't using it. Like dolls wasn't my thing. Like I wasn't able to like take an alligator and to like pretend. I kind of wish like that I was able to do that, but it's I think it's just like it shaped my personality of like reality, and like just like very grounded in that space. But I think that there is a loss, like the fact that I can't and couldn't go into imagination as much. Like over time, like I tried my best to like develop that, and developed it as much as I could. But so obviously not every child is going to be able to do that. But I think like with a parent, like when you go there, it feels silly. It feels silly, and like it's almost like uncomfortable to
Right,
go
it's
there. It's like
uncomfortable.
this feels dumb. Like what if somebody is watching me? Like I always think like when I'm playing with a kid, like if somebody's gonna be watching me, like what are they gonna be thinking? Like I look completely ridiculous. Like here I am, like playing with this dolphin, or here I am, like making believe that we're like building like um some roller coaster, and we're gonna like fly off, and like and when you're in it, you're fully in it. But I think like it's hard to be in it when you have these voices like that are coming out and saying like, this is ridiculous, like
Right.
you look like a complete like dumb person, like what are you doing? And like there's lots of like those judgments. I think some of that like some of those feelings of ridiculousness like come from the fact that we don't value play. Like we think play is like
Right.
boring, or play is just for kids, or play is not important. Like okay, you have to like take up time, go play. But also because like we're a society that focuses on productivity. We don't focus on play.
Right.
And so there's a lot of like shame in being able to do the play. Whereas like if we would value play as a society, like I was researching like in Finland, like they always like they have these slogans where they say like let them go play, like make sure they're playing, because they recognize how important it is that children are sitting together and using that part of
Right.
themselves.
There's a lot of shame that comes back, either mom shaming that you're not doing good enough,
Hmm.
or when you actually are trying to allow yourself to get into a present moment of play, all the shame of childhood
Hmm.
that comes up, of society's pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, like, for me, like reading a book is safer, or, playing a game is safer rather than going into like that imagination space, because it's like this something weird might come up, or
Right.
this might be awkward or uncomfortable. And, I might make up something and you might giggle and like it might be silly, but then there's possibility of like, this is embarrassing.
Yeah. I think that like we brought up so many, like, at least for myself, like relating to really good blockages that come up with being able to play with your children.
Yeah.
And I would love to like kind of do a part two of like a little bit of like, there's no big magic answer, but some things that we've learned ourselves that we've heard about
Hmm.
that can help a little bit.
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks for all this information. It was great.
Yeah. Looking forward to part two.